everyone. Today I want to talk about the Stop Killing Games initiative that's been making waves in the gaming community. There's been a lot of discussion around this and unfortunately some misinformation too. So let's break down what this initiative actually does, what it doesn't do, and why it matters for all of us as gamers. But before we dive in, I just want to clarify, I'm not a drama channel. I don't want to be a drama channel. I just want to kind of clarify and clear up some points that I'm seeing going around the internet regarding the Stop Killing Games initiative. I also want to give you some context about my perspective. I've been working in software development for 5 years now, doing everything from embedded software development with drones at a huge corporation to doing full stack web development for startups. And before that, I spent 4 years in IT, doing everything from data center support to on-site IT to IT management and even DevOps. So while I'm not specifically a game developer, I do understand the technical and business challenges that come with software development, server maintenance, and product lifecycle management. And despite understanding these specific challenges, I still strongly support this initiative. I feel that the positives far outweigh the negatives, and I'll explain why throughout this video. All right, so first, let's address the elephant in the room. Some people have been saying that this initiative would force developers to keep game servers running forever, and that it would bankrupt small indie developers. In my opinion, that's simply not true. The initiative isn't asking for eternal server support or unlimited resources from developers. What it's actually asking for, in my opinion, is pretty reasonable. When a game is sold to consumers, especially games that require online connectivity to function, developers should have some responsibility to ensure that when they decide to shut down their servers, they provide a way for the game to remain playable. And this could include a lot of different solutions. It could mean things like releasing server software, providing offline modes, or transitioning to some form of peer-to-peer functionality. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, but what about the technical challenges? And what about proprietary code? Now, these are very valid concerns, and the initiative acknowledges them. It's not asking for developers to release their entire source code or compromise their intellectual property. In fact, there are various technical solutions that can preserve functionality without actually exposing any sensitive business information or compromising contracts that they might have with third parties. Right, but let's talk about why this matters for consumer rights. When you buy a game, you're making a purchase with the reasonable expectation that you'll be able to play it, right? But right now, publishers can essentially render your purchase worthless by shutting down servers, even for single-player games that require online connectivity for no real technical reason. It's a lot like buying a car and having the manufacturer remotely disable it a few years later. Some critics argue that this would stifle innovation or hurt the games industry, but consider this if you will. Requiring basic consumer protections hasn't hurt other industries in the past. In fact, it drives innovation. When companies know that they can't rely on planned obsolescence, they're incentivized to create better and more sustainable products. The initiative also isn't anti-developer or anti-business. Many developers actually support the idea of game preservation. They understand that their work is art and culture, not just a disposable product. Some have already started implementing these practices voluntarily, releasing tools and server software when they shut down official support. Now let's address the scope. This initiative specifically targets games that are sold as products but become unplayable due to server shutdowns. It's currently not about subscription services or free-to-play games because those terms are different. It's about purchased products that should reasonably continue to function. There's also the argument that this would somehow hurt smaller developers more than large publishers. Actually, the opposite is often true. Big publishers are the ones most likely to shut down servers prematurely to push players towards a newer release or a newer product. Small developers will often maintain their communities for years because they value that relationship. Also think about the time and monetary commitment that goes into producing these large games. A lot of the time, these smaller indies don't even have those resources, so they're less likely to create something that big in the first place. The preservation aspect is crucial too. Video games are a significant part of our cultural heritage in the present day, and when games become unplayable, we lose digital art, interactive stories, and innovative gameplay mechanics forever. And this isn't just about individual consumer rights, it's about preserving our medium's history for future generations to come. Now, some people worry about the legal implications or the enforcement. The initiative proposes reasonable, graduated responses. It's not about punitive measures for past actions, but about establishing clear expectations expectations for future releases. Developers would have more than enough time to adapt their practices, and there would be flexibility for different types of games and business models. This also might be where you can create exceptions for smaller companies or smaller scopes to protect indie developers. I also want to address the concern about multiplayer games. The initiative recognizes that large-scale multiplayer experiences are very different from single-player games that just happen to require online connectivity. The goal isn't to force developers to maintain massive multiplayer servers indefinitely, but to ensure that when possible, some form of the game experience can continue. For example, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League just announced that they are sundancing their game, and they actually have an offline mode available, most likely going to be playing around the core campaign and not with the live service. The economic argument is important too. Right now, the lack of consumer protection actually enables some very predatory practices. Publishers can release games knowing that they'll shut them down in a few years, forcing players to buy newer versions. This creates a cycle where games are treated as disposable rather than long-lasting products. The gaming industry has somehow convinced consumers that paying full price for a product that might stop working is normal. All right, so here's where my technical background really informs my opinion. The initiative isn't perfect. No legislation is. There are edge cases that it doesn't fully address, technical scenarios that might be challenging to implement, and business models that might need to evolve. But the perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. The core principle is sound, and the technical challenges are more than solvable. I've seen game developers argue that this would make game development too expensive or too complex, and maybe it would, but I've also seen what happens when an industry is forced to evolve its practices. The initial adjustment period is always difficult, but the long-term results usually benefit everyone. Better architecture, more sustainable business models, and higher quality products. I mean, from a technical standpoint, many solutions actually already exist. We've seen developers successfully transition games to community-run servers and release dedicated server software and implement offline modes. The technology isn't the barrier here. It's the business model and the legal framework. I mean, we have Docker and Kubernetes. This isn't impossible to do. It's just going to be difficult if you don't plan how you want to sunset your game up front. Now, let me put on my developer hat for a moment. If you know, you know. And I'm going to address some of the technical concerns that I've seen raised. Yes, maintaining legacy systems is expensive. Yes, server costs add up over time. Yes, there are legitimate security concerns with releasing things like server binaries. But here's the thing, these aren't insurmountable problems. They're engineering challenges that we solve every day in the software industry. In my experience, the biggest technical hurdle isn't the complexity of the solution, it's that most game developers don't plan for end-of-life scenarios from the beginning. They will build games with the assumption that their servers will run forever, or at least until the game stops being profitable, at which time they just unplug the servers. But any experienced software developer will tell you that planning for deprecation and sunset scenarios is just good engineering practice. I have worked on enterprise software where we have had to maintain backward compatibility for systems that were 10 years old. I've helped design APIs that needed to gracefully handle version migrations and service discontinuation. These are solved problems in the broader software industry. The gaming industry just hasn't adopted these practices because, frankly, they haven't had to. If this initiative succeeds, it would fundamentally change how games are architected from day one. Developers would start their projects planning for end-of-life scenarios. They'd design their authentication systems to be easily removable. They'd architect their networking code to support both dedicated servers and peer-to-peer connections. They'd separate essential game logic from optional online features. It's really not impossible. And guess what? This isn't just wishful thinking. I've seen this happen in other areas of software development when regulations change. When GDPR was introduced, it didn't kill the web. Instead, it forced developers to build better, more privacy-conscious systems from the ground up. For those who might not be familiar, GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's an EU law that came into effect in 2018, establishing strict rules about how companies can collect, store, and use personal data. Before GDPR, many websites and services were collecting massive amounts of user data without clear consent or transparency about how that data was being used or stored. When GDPR was announced, there was a lot of panic in the tech industry. Companies claimed it would be too expensive to comply, that it would stifle innovation, that smaller businesses wouldn't be able to handle the complexity. Sound familiar? But what actually happened was companies adapted. They built better data management systems, implemented clearer privacy controls, and became more transparent about their practices. And crucially, because the EU market is so large and important, these changes didn't stay confined to Europe. They became global standards. Ultimately, I believe the same principle would apply to game preservation laws if they get passed. The gaming industry ultimately would adapt, and the practices that emerge would likely become standard worldwide. We've already seen this pattern with hardware regulations too. You know the example I'm bringing up, right? The iPhone USB-C. This initiative also has broader implications for digital ownership. As more of our media becomes digital only, establishing the principle that purchased digital goods should remain accessible becomes crucial. And this isn't just about games, it's about setting precedents for digital consumer rights, which honestly have been lacking so much. We need regulation and we need change. Now, I want to acknowledge that this isn't a simple issue with simple solutions, okay? There are legitimate technical, business, and legal challenges, but the core principle is sound. When you sell someone a product, you should provide reasonable assurance that it will continue to function. The initiative also includes provisions for situations where preservation might not be feasible. It's not a blanket mandate that ignores reality. It's a framework that balances consumer rights with business practicalities. And let's be honest, it's not even law yet. It's just asking that the EU address this if we get the signatures. Now, some have argued that this could lead to higher game prices. But consider the current system, if you will. You buy a game at full price. It gets shut down a few years later, and you have to buy a newer version. The total cost to consumers is often higher under the current system than it would be with proper preservation requirements. Also force development companies to innovate and give you something worth buying. The community response to the initiative has been overwhelmingly positive from actual gamers, which tells us something important. The people who actually play these games do understand the value of preservation and consumer protection. I've noticed the resistance mainly comes from corporate interests who benefit from the current system, or sometimes game developers that maybe haven't worked outside of the game development space, where I have seen a lot of these issues addressed in different ways with just as complex code bases and environments around them. What's particularly interesting from a developer perspective is seeing how different studios have responded to this initiative. Some of the smaller, more technically minded studios have actually embraced the principles already, meaning it's not impossible. They're starting to document their server architecture, plan for community handoffs, and design games with preservation in mind from the beginning. And those are the studios that I want to support. Don't take it from me. Let me give you some concrete examples. Take Heroic Labs and their Nakama open source game server framework. They've deliberately built their technology as open source under the Apache 2.0 license specifically, so developers maintain ownership over their technology stack. And that's exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach that the Stop Killing Games initiative is trying to encourage across the industry. Because if you own the stack, you have less outside resources and outside influences that you have to keep in mind when trying to decouple or sunset your game. Then you have community-run server keeping classic MMOs alive long after their official servers were shut down. These projects exist because dedicated fans reverse engineered the server software, exactly the kind of thing that would be much easier if developers planned it from the beginning and even encouraged and allowed the community to act in such a way after the game has been sunset. There's also the recent, miracle with City of Heroes. That game was shut down in 2012, but fans kept private servers running for years. Then in 2024, something incredible happened. NCSoft, the original developer, officially licensed the game to the Homecoming community server. They essentially said, here, you can take care of it now. And the fans who had been preserving the game were rewarded for their dedication. And now the game not only continues to exist, but is actually getting new content supported by the community. Meanwhile, some of the larger publishers are pushing back with arguments that don't really hold water from a technical standpoint, at least not in my opinion. They'll claim that releasing server software would compromise security, but then they'll release modding tools that expose far more of their game's internals. Don't get me wrong, security is a big deal, but it kind of seems to feel more like a cop-out. They'll even argue that maintaining compatibility is too expensive, while simultaneously maintaining backward compatibility for their profitable franchises. And we're not even asking them to maintain compatibility. That would ultimately be up to the community or however the initiative decides to outline those parameters. On the flip side, you have companies like GOG that have built their entire business model around game preservation. They've invested 15 years of development into a custom DirectX wrapper that ensures old games work on modern systems. GOG's preservation program actively fixes compatibility issues and maintains games that would otherwise be lost. And they're doing this profitably. Preservation isn't just good for the consumers, it's good for business. And the contrast is telling. Companies that embrace preservation principles tend to be more transparent about their technical practices and more willing to work with their communities. Companies that resist tend to rely on arguments that don't hold up to technical scrutiny. As someone who's worked in both small startups and larger corporations, I can tell you that this resistance isn't really about technical feasibility. It's about business models that depend on forcing obsolescence. The technical challenges, granted, are real, but they're the kind of challenges that good engineering teams solve every single day. And here's something else I've learned from my time in software development. Developers generally want their code to last. I don't know about you, but I don't write code hoping that it'll be thrown away in 2 years. Iterate it out maybe, but ultimately I want to build things that people will use and enjoy for years to come. The push for planned obsolescence usually comes from business decisions, not technical limitations. So let's talk about the precedent that this sets. If we establish that digital products should have some durability expectations, it can protect us from more aggressive forms of planned obsolescence in the future. It's not just about games, it's about the principle that when you buy something, you should own it in a meaningful way. Looking at the bigger picture, this is part of a broader movement toward digital rights and consumer protection in the modern economy. As digital goods become more and more prevalent, we desperately need frameworks that protect consumers while still allowing businesses to innovate and profit. From my experience in the software industry, I can tell you that regulation often drives innovation rather than stifling it. When we had to comply with accessibility standards, we didn't just grudgingly add screen reader support. Obviously, some people did, but we ended up building better, more inclusive interfaces that benefited everyone. When privacy regulations came into effect, we didn't just add cookie banners. Again, some developers did, but most redesigned data architectures to be more secure and efficient. Like I said, it's not just about software. We've seen this pattern in hardware too. Just remember when Apple insisted they couldn't possibly switch the iPhone to USB-C, they argued that Lightning was superior and that the change would be too disruptive, that it would hurt innovation. But the EU passed legislation requiring a common charging standard, and suddenly Apple found a way to make USB-C work beautifully on the iPhone 15. Not only did they make it work, but they actually improved the user experience with faster charging and data transfer speeds. They iterated on top of it and made the technology better. Here's the key point that often gets missed in discussions about the Stop Killing Games initiative. Apple wasn't required to retroactively retrofit USB-C into every iPhone ever made. They weren't forced to recall the iPhone 14 and physically replace the Lightning ports. The regulation applied to future products moving forward. The same principle would apply to game preservation laws. Existing games wouldn't need to be retroactively fixed, but new games would need to be designed with an end-of-life plan from the start. I don't think that's too much to ask. I really don't. The point is, when companies are forced to meet higher standards, they don't just grudgingly comply, they often end up creating better products to be more competitive within the market. The iPhone with USB-C isn't a compromised version of what Apple wanted to build. It's actually better for consumers than what we had before, and protected the consumer from predatory practices. The same principle applies here. Yes, game developers would need to change how they approach architecture and project planning, but the result would be more robust, more sustainable games that hopefully provide better value to consumers. And frankly, as someone who's worked on legacy systems, I can tell you that planning for long-term maintainability from the beginning is always cheaper and better and more efficient than trying to retrofit it later. Yes, I get it. Things happen. You're going to have to go back and update things, but starting from the beginning with the plan is going to make it so much better. Now, I want to address one more technical point that I keep seeing in discussions. Some developers argue that security implications of releasing server software is just too risky. And I get it. As someone who's worked with both public-facing and internal systems, I completely understand this concern. But let's be real here. It's not an insurmountable problem. You can strip out authentication systems, remove database connection strings, and even sandbox the networking components. You can provide containerized versions that limit system access. These are standard practices in in the software industry already. I mean, again, Docker or Kubernetes, these things exist. It's just not currently being used in the gaming space. Ultimately, I believe the Stop Killing Games initiative represents a very balanced approach to these challenges. I don't feel that it's anti-business or unreasonably demanding. It's asking for basic consumer protections that we take for granted in other industries. So here's where you come in. This is crucial. None of this happens if they don't get the signatures. The Stop Killing Games initiative needs to reach a specific threshold of signatures to be taken seriously by EU lawmakers. Without those signatures, all of our discussions about technical feasibility, consumer rights, and industry practices are just theoretical because it's not a law right now. It's just asking the EU to look and address this concern, and hopefully create some laws. So if you're in the EU, you can sign this initiative, and I genuinely urge you to do so. The deadline for signatures is approaching at the end of July, and every single signature matters. We need a total of 1 million, and we are just over 500,000. This isn't hyperbole. EU initiatives have specific numerical thresholds, and falling short means the proposal doesn't move forward, regardless of how good the idea is. Now me, I'm not in the EU. I am in America. And if you're like me, you can still support the movement by raising awareness, contacting your local representatives. I doubt that'll do much in America, but at least it's something, and support the developers who already practice good preservation policies. Again, I'm just one developer, and everyone's going to have a different perspective, including different types of developers. But from my perspective, I want to emphasize something important. This initiative succeeding would create a ripple effect that goes beyond just the EU regulations. Again, major game publishers aren't going to maintain completely different development processes for different games. If EU law requires games to be designed with end-of-life planning, that standard will likely become global. This is a big deal here. The EU has some of the strongest consumer protection laws. They are our biggest hope right now. But guys, this is our chance to have a real impact on how the game industry operates moving forward. I'm so tired of getting dicked around, and the window for citizen input is limited. And once it closes, and you just get dicked around by big corporations forever. I really, really do. And this isn't about being anti-developer or anti-innovation or anti-indie studio. Or anti-live service, or anti-MMO, or anti-online only. It's about ensuring that the games that we love and pay for remain playable. It's about preserving our modern day digital culture and establishing fair consumer protections for the digital age. And again, as someone who works in the industry that would be affected by this, I can tell you that the long-term benefits far outweigh the short-term adjustment costs. The future of gaming doesn't have to be one where your purchases become worthless at the whim of a publisher. We can have a sustainable, consumer-friendly industry that still allows for innovation and profit, but it requires us to speak up and demand better. And most importantly, it requires us to participate in the democratic process when we have the opportunity. Maybe getting a little long-winded here, I know, but just to hammer this home, the technical challenges are solvable. The business models can adapt. The legal framework can and will be refined, but none of that matters if the initiative doesn't get enough signatures to move forward. So if you're eligible to sign, please do it today. If you're not, please share this information and support the movement however you can. Anyway, thanks for listening to my long-winded rant. And thank you for watching. Let's keep this conversation going in the comments below. Do you agree with the initiative? Do you agree with my assessments of the concerns? Are there other concerns that you would want to see addressed? Do you not agree with the initiative? Also, I will go ahead and put a link to Stop Killing Games initiative itself so that you can do some research on your own. I encourage you to research this on your own. And I'll put a link to the petition. If you are in the EU, you can go ahead and sign that. Anyway, thank you again so much for your time. Have a fantastic day and peace out.